All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Scott Wadlow. We're at his home in Portland. Scott from Sis and May Wine Company. It's August 4th, 2020. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Having us here. First question, and most important question for our purposes, is why wine?
Oh, wow. So I've always worked, I sort of stumbled into the non-wine work that I do, and it is, I sell consulting hours essentially and run consulting teams to do HR and payroll software. So it's rather, it does best when there's no creativity in it other than how you manage and interact with people, which is why I actually really like that work as well. But sort of there's a right answer, there's a way to do it, it's a lot of contracts, it's a lot of making sure things happen by a certain date. And so partway probably through my 20s, I thought I really need some sort of hobby, some sort of outlet, something. And this was in the, gosh, I don't know, this was 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. So the whole concept of blogging was sort of at a height. It was widely known and accepted, but it wasn't a part of our vernacular like it is now, or a part of our culture like it is now. And I thought, I'm gonna do a blog. That's what I'm gonna do. I'm interested in writing. I'm interested in exploring, but I had no idea what to do a blog about. And then I also recognized that I enjoyed going out to eat and interacting with food industry and food culture and those sorts of things a lot, and that I had no idea about wine, and I always felt confounded by it and intimidated by it. And that it seemed to be a part of some side of that culture that maybe was interesting. And I thought, you know what? I could learn about wine and blog about the process of learning about wine. Well, very quickly that became pretty all-consuming, just because there was so much to know about it. There was this small group of very dedicated, and I think this was happening in a lot of industries or a lot of topics. I did not realize that wine blogging was a thing, but there was obviously this culture around it and this sort of dumbing down or almost reclaiming of the conversation from these people that we'd always deemed as experts. And again, not exclusive to wine, sort of blogging and the consumerization of sharing opinions and the whole thing that was happening online and moving towards social media, essentially, was happening. And so it was easy to become deeply involved in this thing, and wineries were absolutely not sure what to do with this. And so I was given tremendous access to the industry, really. I mean, there was like these really early wine blogger conferences and all these things that like samples started appearing on my doorstep and all of this thing, and it was very exciting and fun and interesting. And I also quickly became really uncomfortable with the ethics of it and who am I, and I don't know, it was an interesting exploration, but I became fascinated by the idea of this truly agricultural product that had this whole history, that had massive inputs from the climate, from the soil, from the year, from the person, from the vinification process, that made it so unique from almost everything else we consumed that tried to have this consistency and this formulas. And so it felt like a bottomless pit of something that I could explore and connect to, and I just loved it. But I also have a bit of a, I guess you could call it type A. I'm not sure if I'm type A, but there was the economics of it, the accessibility of it, the part of making it actually commercially viable also was hugely of interest. So I may do one of those where you ask me one question and I go on for an hour and give you the whole story.
Fantastic.
I was living in LA, and we can get into more of the personal journey if that comes up or not. And through connections I made with blogging, I stopped blogging, and I went to one of my favorite tiny, weird little hole-in-the-wall wine shops in Pasadena and said, I want to work weekends here. So I had this full-time, salaried, comfortable job. I want to work weekends here because I want to understand working with buyers. I want to understand working with the public on this and helping people figure out what they want to drink. I want to sample a lot more wines than I can afford to buy. I want to understand how, I was really fascinated on how the perception of California wine in a California market was, framing up what consumers purchased or thought. Their experiences going up to, in LA, we had Central Coast and Paso Robles and Temecula were sort of day trippable, but then we also had Sonoma and Napa, and the vast majority of the production was happening in our state. So I wanted to understand all of these things. So I worked there in trade for wine and for no money for several years, started getting to work with buying some and working with the importers and the reps from all the books and understanding that side of things. Started teaching wine appreciation classes. I never did any formalized, like get my WSET or anything like that, but certainly did a lot of the self-study around that. Worked for a company that was trying to do these appreciation classes in conjunction with local restaurants. It was a really fun experience. Started my own sort of consulting, tasting company doing those privately, and just kind of got into that side, retail, and then started doing some buying for restaurants and building out lists and training staff. And all of this was like nights and weekends, and I absolutely loved it, and would work behind the bar some nights, and it was infinitely fascinating to me. And now comes in, so I grew up in Oregon, grew up in Albany, and so was always tangentially aware, had family here, we'd come back all the time, tangentially aware of the Oregon wine industry, but had a unique perspective of it, I think, or impression of it, I should say, in that it was such a minor part of what was available and known in Southern California in the wine scene, and it didn't sit in the same place that other non-California wines did, because it was domestic and the neighbor, it just wasn't of interest. We had everything we wanted from California, and then we were particularly interested in other New World wines and all of Europe, of course, and so it literally was like one sort of blind spot. And what we did have in Southern California was either the huge players. You could go to Costco and get Erath and A to Z, or Evolution, or you could get some of the people who did. If you went somewhere that really curated, then you would get some of the pioneers because people knew they were important, or you would get some of the, you'd get Beaufrere or Serene or some of the just higher end, higher priced, the perpetuation of having our own place, but sort of maybe it's somewhere that in the United States that can do something similar to Burgundy with the, and that wasn't like completely perpetuated, but just sort of that's what we had access to or interest in, or what the buyers down there thought to curate, for all kinds of reasons. I don't think that's bad, but that was what I knew about Oregon wine. I knew I either needed $60 or it wasn't something I was particularly interested in exploring once I'd had it once. When we moved back, I sort of lost all the contacts and relationships and everything I had there. I knew I wanted to do something in the industry, but I also knew I didn't have any contacts here. I didn't understand the industry here. And I really sat back and contemplated, do I want to go into it as a career and get started in some company that can actually work for a winery that actually can support a full-time position? I don't have a resume that's going to be particularly attractive unless I meet people, and it's going to look very business focused. But I have loved the relationships. I've loved the experiences of the consumers I've interacted with. And I have a lot to learn. And I realized that my other career had positioned me that I felt fairly comfortable to do something with starting a brand and a business. I understand that side of things, and that the challenge of developing sales channels and the challenge of learning how to make wine was what I wanted to tackle. So that's why wine. What I've done within that is, there's a lot more to it, but that's why wine. When I moved back, I wanted to keep this going, and I looked at all options, and starting a brand and learning to make the product was really made sense and was feasible at this time to start doing.
So we're going to get back to that in a second, but I want to back up for a second. I'm curious, you talk about the kind of the perfect timing of starting a wine blog at the kind of the right moment and getting that kind of interesting access. I'm curious about learning wine that way and about learning it sort of publicly. Tell me about the process of learning wine and understanding wine, and what were the challenges? What were the interesting parts for you?
Looking back, it was good what I didn't know at the time, because I probably made some pretty embarrassing assumptions. But I find in general that the wine world, current things that I'm opening my mind to and looking, I want to clarify the statement I'm about to make, but I find the wine world is pretty open to people who have an interest. It's built on relationships. It's built on human connection. You said before we started that the wine is more fun to drink if you know the people behind it. I think that the whole concept of terroir has people built into it, and the people who touch it, and that's why the topic is interesting at all. So in that regard, self-study, exploring it yourself, it's actually, if you're willing to put yourself out there a little bit, I find people to be very open to share with you what they know, why they're excited about it, and I find that to be contagious. But I also like to study, so I read a lot of books that are quite technical, and a lot of books about history, and I made flashcards to understand varieties and where they come from and regions, because I kind of get off on that kind of stuff. So the challenges were overcomable by, like, the interest can self-perpetuate the learning, I think, in this, for this topic. I think there's but there are challenges in two regards. I said it would come back. I think as an industry that my presentation allowed me a level of access that I didn't understand at the time, and that I continue to try to understand, because I think absolutely that as a means of not commoditizing the product, which is important, that we have developed it into a product that's only for people who can financially have access to it, but also that look a certain way, that talk a certain way, that fall into a narrow lifestyle. I still see so much marketing that just drives me crazy. I see the way we build up visits to these wineries to have access that I was just given because I had this blog, like, of course, come in. And again, at the time I was like, well, they perceive that they might need my words or need my access to other consumers or something. So there's this huge self-perpetuating and therefore sort of discriminating inadvertently that wine drinkers and wine consumers are a certain type. I recognize now that I am easily perceived to be someone worth getting the attention and information, and so I did not have that stumbling block, and yet I know that it exists. I think that we are totally generally failing on making it, maintaining how interesting it can be and how complex it can be and how that is of interest. But then that it also, we want it to be accessible to people. So there's some exclusive air that has to be around it to make it, I think, financially viable. Anyway, those are the things I think about in terms of the stumbling about how to learn about it. Literally, I think the way that I present and look allowed someone to take a chance on me doing their restaurant list and me being their buyer and me training their staff. So I think I'm thinking about those things now. I don't know where that leaves us, but I also, in my brand, and when I was like, well, I'm in a position to do this, I quickly realized that's what, I don't know that it's missing because I now see some other places that do this, but I want to make wines, and I know we have grapes in Oregon to do so, that you just buy them and drink them. They're uniquely Oregonian. They're unique to the vintage. They're unique to what we can do here, but they're also like, just buy it and drink it. Like, we're not thinking about it. We're not putting it in a context of the world. We're not getting too dogmatic about its production. There are things I definitely care about in how they're produced. Don't get me wrong, but like it's just wine. It's just wine. It's just grapes that we grew here, and we did our best, and we put them out there, and I can get more into that.
It's a lot to juggle. It's a lot to kind of try to have both. You say have both sides: the exclusivity versus the interest versus the kind of complexity. So it's interesting. As you were tasting through Oregon, tasting through in California, and the part where you're building wine lists and you're buying for wine. Tell me what you looked for as you were creating a wine list. What spoke to you, and how did you create a list?
Yeah, the place I worked at the longest had a successful restaurant in Whittier, California called Flight, and they really kind of off the hip and based on price point were buying wines from around the world that they thought tasted good, and they were doing a joint partnership in a new restaurant that was going to be seafood driven, but like Mexican seafood and then sort of elevated. And they had in their head quite strongly they wanted an all French list because they thought that they got to a rotating wine list over here meant that the neighborhood that they were in was ready to kind of move forward, and in their mind that meant let's do no California and all France. At the time, I was like, let's make sure we sell wine. Let's do what we need to do to sell wine rather than have a strict, But I was also excited about the opportunity to introduce people to things that they might not be as familiar with. So I cared a lot that the wines, I cared a lot about price point because I think that mattered a lot on whether we were going to move the wine, and then I cared about finding something that wouldn't be so old world in its styling that it would be completely unfamiliar to the population that I knew would come into the restaurant, which were mostly probably $10 California off-the-shelf wine drinkers mostly, and a few trips to Temecula or somewhere that makes really juicy, really big fruit. And that if I could get their interest in understanding how it was complementing the food that they were having and not clashing with the food they were having without going way overboard on like you pick up on this flavor, and the chef used this herb, because no one wanted to have that conversation. I was not going to get my servers to have that conversation, but just spark an interest of like, wow, we went through that bottle, and there was some symbiosis there. Our overall experience was fantastic, and also that feeling that I would get sometimes where this is unfamiliar to me, but we're going to take a chance, and what a great experience. That sort of like, I don't think I've ever had a white Burgundy before, but I've heard about that, and then you talked me into this one, and then I loved it, and the whole dining experience was awesome. So those sorts of things. I had importers that I knew I wanted to work with because I just trusted them. Yeah, so I built that list out. It was sort of successful. I felt like everything worked really, really well. And then we sold a ton of beer at that restaurant. So that's just how that went. We did some like, third bottle, 2/3 bottle full carafe sales, really inexpensive, and people loved that. And actually that was kind of early in the development of what I wanted to do with Sis and May, which was like, bring the bottle out, pour it in your cup. I don't care what the cup looks like. This doesn't need to be I don't know. That it's just literally, I want it to make you feel happy and feel celebratory that you're having it, but I don't want you to think too much about it. And I want you to get to the end of the meal and remember the meal and the people you were with, and that whatever was on the table totally enhanced that experience, but I don't have an interest in sitting here and dissecting the sandalwood versus cedar and the cranberry versus, I don't. There are times and places that maybe I can geek out on that personally, but in general, I really loved having it written on a chalkboard what the wine was, but it comes to you in a carafe and everyone filling it into their cups and drinking it. And like I said, in California, we didn't have Oregon wines in that price point, or that weren't big commodity wines that were a little bit too indistinct for to be.
So you come back to Oregon, and before we get to your own personal project, I'm curious, coming back to Oregon from that background, what were your impressions of Oregon's wine industry as you came back into it?
So last couple of years that I was in LA, when I was working at that restaurant, one of the books that I used, and unfortunately was limited to just wines from Europe, I expanded them to include a little bit of Italian and Spanish wine at the end there, so I could get a little more fruit forward and sell some more wine. But a good friend of mine had a book down there, and she picked up Goodfellow, and she picked up Division winemaking, and I think oh gosh, I can totally picture it. They mostly do Pinot and Chardonnay. A man and a woman.
Not narrowing it down yet.
We went from 800 down to 750 wineries. No, it'll come to me. And so I started to get...
Walter Scott?
Yeah, because it's Walter Scott. Yep.
Nice.
Did you know they were the same distributor down there? I mean, that is a good pinpoint.
It was really a Chardonnay. I don't know why. But,
yeah. It's totally Walter Scott. Erica and
Ken Paolo.
Yep. Yep. So it was Division in particular that I started to see. Oh, there's people making wine in Portland. There's and I knew what they were doing with sort of their space, which kind of got me down a rabbit hole of looking at some really micro brands, and then started to see some media around, Oregon is the most exciting wine frontier, and I'm like, it doesn't feel exciting from what I see on the shelves down here. So got here and was again able to kind of, in the same method that I've always learned about wine, I kind of probably subconsciously know what I'm looking for in people's marketing or in web searches or something to find brands and bottles to try that would interest me. Super important to me that I found wine shops that I trusted the people whose living is to curate things specific. And so that helped me see some brands and kind of understand, like, there's a lot of experimentation going on, and there's actually a lot of great wine in the $18 to $35 range that are from these really small brands and from people who are trying to do something interesting. And so, that influenced my perception of, that definitely influenced my perception. Because I really, probably 10 years ago, I would tell you, people would say, well, you're from Oregon. Do you ever drink Oregon wine? I'd be like, I don't have $50 and I'm not that into, I'm not into the way they're crafting those Pinots necessarily. I do like a lot of them, but that's just kind of what I thought they did. And then there's this argument about, well, we went with Gris, but Chardonnay should really be our grape. And I think there's some gorgeous Oregon Chardonnays, but I also wasn't particularly interested in that conversation. So I had to be here to realize there's a much broader conversation, there's a much broader experimentation, and that it's actually a really exciting place. And not that it wasn't exciting when it was, is Oregon the New World Burgundy and pioneers and getting attention outside of California. That was exciting, but that wasn't particularly something that I attached to. So that's how it changed when I got here. I was just, being in Portland, I got to see how much else is going on.
You mentioned the challenges you're looking forward to, learning how to make wine and then learning how to sell and market your wine. So tell me about, let's talk about the first one first. Talk about how to make.
So, I had quite a bit of book knowledge about how wine was made, but that is pretty different from hands-on knowledge. So I could talk you through the whole process. I knew where decision points were made, and I felt like I'd been given enough insight just in relationships I had with wineries and winemakers through all of the other stuff I talked about to have a pretty realistic understanding of those decision points and what was sexy and what was work. And I feel like I have an idea, but I haven't done the process from start to finish by myself at all. So I contemplated, do I want to do a label and a brand and make those decisions and do like a real custom crush situation and have a lot of creative control over it, but not be in the cellar. I looked at some options for that, and then I thought, no, if I'm going to do this, I really want to learn it. So I found a situation that is working very well for there to be guardrails on my learning process, but allow me to be as hands-on as I can and want to be. So I make the wines at Lady Hill in St. Paul with Dan Dury, who is their Lady Hill's head winemaker. He does do some, they're pretty open about that they do some custom crush for some labels. And then he is just extraordinarily flexible with letting me be very, very involved. And it's my brand, and I can learn. But then I also realistically have equipment and a crew that I can put in work orders. And if I need something racked and can't get to it, those sorts of things. Guardrails around learning how to use all the equipment. And to bounce off like, hey, Dan, I want to be as low sulfur as is at all possible. Here's what I'm thinking, but I want to bounce this off someone who's doing this for 15 years. I do my wines in a much more minimal intervention style, natural style than Lady Hill does. They're still pretty. They're not. They're still pretty minimal, but there's a margin between us. So I think he really enjoys sort of like both of us exploring and talking to people about, okay, I don't want, what are my considerations for not sulfuring on the crush pad and those those sorts of things, something he hasn't done before, and so I think he enjoys that. So we work together a lot, and that is his space to be in charge of. I mean, that's his. He is paid to do so. So that journey has been fantastic, and that partnership has been fantastic. And I still don't feel like I want to do it here by myself, because I think what I gained from that relationship is really, really important. And I'm just heading into my 4th harvest this fall. So that's the process of learning it. It's fun to, occasionally we've shared fruit sources. So it's really fun to see like the decisions and influences I make side by side with fruit that literally came in together and then was treated separately from the time it got dumped out of the bins at Lady Hill. So that's the making side of it. That's been a huge journey and eye-opener. And again, I really do feel like I went in with my eyes open about at what points decisions would need to be made. I do all my own fruit sourcing, have all the contracts with the farmers myself, with a few exceptions where I've said, hey Dan, I know you're getting Gris out of this vineyard. I need a little bit of Gris for what I'm planning to do. Could that work out? Yeah, and I think fruit selection is probably by far the largest. You know, a lot of wineries grow there, so the farming is the largest part. For me, the farming is the largest part. What fruit am I going to use? What's my relationship with the farmer? What influence do I have on that? When are we going to pick that? How are they going to farm it? What's been done with that fruit before? How can I react to what's been done with that fruit before? I think I would have told you from what I knew sort of with book smarts that that's the case, but the reality of that is probably the biggest thing I've learned about winemaking. Like, the grapes that come in determine what wine you're going to have.
So now that you know that, and now that you're experiencing that, tell me about some answers to some of those questions. Who do you want to work with, and what kind of grapes, what kind of vineyards are you looking for?
I worked a lot with Johan Vineyard because it's biodynamic, and I cared about it being biodynamic, not exclusively, but because I know what that means about the inputs and the attention. I enjoy working with that vineyard because there's so many examples of what comes out of there, so you can really I could start to wrap my head around which blocks and clones I'm working with versus what I decide to do with it once I receive it, because I have so many places to compare it to. You know, it's fascinating. I made a rosé out of there, and Johan made a rosé out of there, off the same grapes that came in that day. They were picking for rosé, and I needed a little bit, and man, they're almost identical with just and I threw all my juice in a stainless steel tank. I think they threw theirs in their stainless steel tank. We both let them, initiate natively, but I work in a winery that does other lots, and so I know I got different yeast in there ultimately than they did, because they don't have commercial yeast at all. Anyway, those two wines are so similar with just a little bit of a flavor at the end. So those kind of things I enjoy working with, somewhere that a lot of places are taking fruit from, and biodynamic. But I don't exclusively only work with biodynamic grapes. So the other places, sometimes I share fruit sources with Lady Hill, and that is more out of convenience when I need a really small amount of something to round something out. And then finally, I've worked several years in different scenarios with people who have worked with Oregon vineyards for a long time, and then have opportunities to lease out and do kind of their own thing. And I really like those relationships, because these are people who know how to farm, but are kind of in a similar position to me, where they're like, I love this, I want this to be financially viable, and I'm going to do something small that I care about, and that is a lot based on relationships. So, so in those cases, I wouldn't take anyone who is, using Roundup and totally conventionally farming, but I don't need I don't personally care if it has the certification. As long as they're farming sustainably and organically, things are clean, that they are aware of where they exist within the larger ecosystem. I'm good with that. My production is so small, I'm also not looking at I need to get huge yields off this acreage because I'm going to go into this giant, I'm processing 60 tons into my $14 screw top green. Like those kind of considerations aren't there for me. So, I really care about the relationship. So, I work a lot with a guy who works full-time for one of the big wineries as their vineyard manager. And then him and his brother have these small places that people have leased out to them on their properties. I think I get interesting varieties off those properties. I think I get a lot of relationship and influence. This section of Gamay is Scott's Gamay, and we're texting back and forth and come look at this and what do you want to do with that? And I have access to go walk those rows, and I really like that too. And calls me up and says, we're dropping fruit today, why don't you come out and grab, so I can be in the vineyard with them. So I'll always I have no intention of ever owning vines myself. I had no intention of starting a winery either when I moved up here, so I guess I should never say never, but that's the type of relationship I want and the types of places I want to buy out of. I also don't have real interest in buying $4,500 a ton Pinot and doing something because the national media tends to give high scores to this vineyard. I think that's a necessary part of our industry, the heritage of specific sites and the consistency of specific sites, but it's not particularly what I want to. I wouldn't get off on working with that personally. I'll leave that to people who craft the edges of their wine and care about that kind of thing.
So before we talk about selling wine, which I'm really curious about, let's talk about just the actual logistics of starting a label. Obviously, you've talked about kind of choosing your grapes and what you want to do. Tell me about choosing a name and choosing kind of the, an ethos or a public face for your company. Yeah.
That was probably the most thrilling part of the whole process, was trying to figure that out. If I'm going to do this, how am I going to do it? Why am I going to do it? So, I guess I'll just dive into the name. Sis and May, Sis is the nickname of my grandmother, paternal grandmother, and May is her sister-in-law, so her brother's wife, obviously. They were the first on my dad's side to move to Oregon. They came from New Mexico, and they initially settled around Jacksonville, which I actually work with grapes from Southern Oregon as well. Very short period of time, and I think they moved to Central Point or something for a few months, and then ended up mostly around Corvallis. And then in my childhood, they were up here, actually just nearby in out by Washington Square. So I don't know if they were in Beaverton or Raleigh Hills or whatever, somewhere out there. And then retired down to Jefferson, Oregon. I actually was at Grandma's funeral when a bunch of cousins that I don't know, because she had 13 siblings that all ended up coming to Oregon. And so when I say cousins, they were my dad's age, so they were mid-60s and older, kept talking about their memories of her, and they kept saying, I just have this imprint of Sis and May on the porch. And I knew about Aunt May, but I haven't met Aunt May. So both of them were total chain smokers, drank coffee from 6 a.m. to about 4 p.m., to also teetotalers, did not drink alcohol at all. I always teased that Grandma was kind of mean. You knew she loved you, but she was kind of mean. She was just kind of harsh and rough around the edges, and I remember threatening to put a knot in my head and I never knew if that meant she was going to pound me and make like a knot, or if she was going to tie my hair in a knot. But either way, it was very threatening. And you know, she worked in Corvallis. She worked like at a dry cleaner, and she worked at a hair salon, and just real working class kind of stuff. But she also had this like pride in her sort of self-identity. And so she sort of had, she would say things that were really awful in terms of being politically correct and progressive, but had this fierce independence, and that she could do it, and that a man shouldn't tell her what to do, and that she cared a lot about her right to vote, and she would tell you very much what she was going to vote, and that no one can tell you what to do. And you know, she had this spirit about her that was both sort of problematic, but also fiercely independent. And so in my adulthood, not living in Oregon, there was something about the Willamette Valley sort of that I always found to be like both progressive but also sort of problematic. And so there was something about her spirit that really defined to me sort of what Oregonians and that in my childhood, or the generation that came before me, kind of were. Like, she was very much someone who would always go into her chest freezer and have you know, stuff from around here, that would make her own stuff and have her own fruits and vegetables and jams and stuff that she and we would eat the nuts that were from around here. And so there was just this, and then the vision of the two of them kind of like always being on the porch. So they're sort of looking out for the kids, but they're also annoyed by the kids and doing laundry. There was just something about it that I was like, that's the spirit of Oregon that is sort of in me, that is sort of like calling me back, but is also somehow to me attached to the what I want to do with Oregon wine, and my perception of Oregon wine is that like, who cares? Try your best. Be independent. Like, let's do this. Let's drink this. Let's see what we grow here. Even when what we grow, in addition to that, we've got some attention, which I think is super important, or else none of us would be able to do this for these high-end New World versions of Burgundy. And so it just sort of came together to me like, I like the ring of it. There's something sort of feminist about it. There's something cute about the name, but it also really represents something to me. That all came together. So I sort of sat down and wrote about like taking out the cigarettes, taking out the that she was mean. Like, how could I get this across in a couple paragraphs if I were going to say why this name and whether you attach to it or not. And I really liked how the story of like, how can we have something that is uniquely Oregon, but also really accessible and understandable. And so that's where it went. Because again, I really care about the reason I like wine, why wine at the beginning, is because it can only ever happen. Each bottle you have, we can mechanize stuff and chemicalize stuff to get something super consistent. And there's a place for that as a grape flavored product that people want to drink. I like having a Rainier beer now and then, and I want it to be exactly the same. But the reason I love it is because it can only ever happen then and there and with that. And so that is inherently uniquely Oregon when you have an Oregon wine. And it's fine to compare it and say like, wow, we do all sauce varieties really well. And this is reminiscent of, my dad talks about one of the wines being like, this tastes like all the wines I had on our Rhine River cruise. And I take that as a compliment for sure. I like doing those comparisons, but it only ever happened that year like that.
So you've got your brand, and you've got your kind of idea for what you're going to do with your grapes. So tell me about selling. Tell me about taking your product to market. You've bought wine, you've been invested in wine all this time. Now you finally have a product of your own. What's it like being on that side?
I really enjoy selling to the public. So I don't have a tasting room. I don't have a spot in a tasting room. So the business plan has always been to do events, and I was hopeful that if I did one event a month, sort of built out some sort of mailing list at least, and I wanted to have organ distribution because I do not have time. I still keep a full-time day job because this is, I make very small amounts of wine and struggle to sell it. I wanted organ distribution just so it was available locally to back up that I'm having events, and because I can work those markets at least. And then if I could have maybe 2 more states of distribution that were taking some of, I do a entry-level Pinot that I really like, and that's really hard to sell in Oregon because there's a lot of it. So 2 more states to take that would be the plan. I love the events. They're exhausting, but like to connect with people, to see people enjoying it, to hear feedback, positive and negative, I really love that. That takes a lot of time too, to find the events, to do all the applications for them, to try and evaluate which ones are worth the table fees, which ones are you going to get repeat customers, which ones are you just lost in a sea, which ones are about connecting to other people in the industry, because we talk about getting cellar palate, where you only taste your own wines. You also can get so caught up in running yours that like, it's not like I'm friends with the other 700 wineries. I know some people, but it's hard to be out there. And I have no interest in going tasting by the time I'm done with all my work. I'm interested in tasting the wines, but not necessarily in spending a day going tasting. So I love that part of it. I have a distributor here in Portland, and he is great. And supporting him and backing him up is something that I do have time to do because he takes a heavy lift on delivering and opening new accounts. But it's slow going. That's, he has some brands that sort of are established and sell themselves, and we have a very open, honest conversation about that. To establish a new small brand takes more of his time, and I appreciate so much that he's taken that on and is working on that. And we're trying to figure out ways to work together, and COVID has changed that considerably. So really didn't have any product have only had product really to even take out for about 2 years now. And it's been slower than I hoped, with some real like bright spots. Like when I'm out there, the response is really good. And my sales plan is always evolving. I don't think I want to do a tasting room. I see that model as, or I read information, hear information that model is not as profitable as it used to be. It's hard. It would take me to a whole nother level of administration and overhead, to lease a building, to have a payroll, to hold that license, to do that reporting. And I don't think I have enough product to make that worth it at this time. But again, things can change, but I do need a few more consistent avenues, which also COVID has offered a few that we'll see if those take off. So I don't do a lot of calls on to buyers. Greg does most of that, and I see where I can back him up. That was pretty intimidating to me before I had him, to do that, because I understand sitting on that side of things and how many people want you to see and how many spots you have. And I wasn't on the buying side in a real wine region where people were self-distributing, so I know that can be for Portland a thing, and for wine country a thing. But for the most part, people were really respectful. I didn't get a ton of placements doing that myself. I didn't know how to do the follow-up. That was the part that was really like getting thrown in the deep end. You say, are you being Portland polite and saying like, call me in 2 weeks? because you don't want to say no to my face, or are you, you know, I don't know. Yeah. So, I mean, to sum that up, direct consumer sales, I love it. I love interacting with the people. I love to see people get excited about stuff and ask questions. I even enjoy, I was really nervous because it's so personal to me. You know, in my day job and where I found success in my other career, I don't make something and present it to people, right, and then watch their reaction. So I was very nervous about that, but I've actually enjoyed the back and forth when someone doesn't like something too, for the most part. I haven't had any bad interactions with that. I've had times where probably some sadistic side of me sees that they had a reaction and then they're embarrassed by the reaction because they think they're hurting my feelings, and I've thought that was kind of funny. And I'm like, but to get a full picture of how this is hitting people has been great. I've enjoyed that sort of, because it is very personal to me. I mean, that I'm actively looking at the fruit set right now that a year and a half from now someone might get to taste, like, and I'll be with that the whole time. It's
So you talked a little bit earlier about sort of the winemaking style you wanted to expand a little bit on your kind of winemaking philosophy, and also how you got to that, coming from of such a diverse background of wine styles.
You know, I haven't really reflected on how I got to that. So, I knew for sure that I wanted to minimize any inputs. So I did not want to inoculate. I want to go as low sulfur as possible. But I do care about protecting the wine when necessary, and I certainly don't want people to buy wines that have gone off. I only want to filter if necessary. That I've really enjoyed wines that are unfiltered in general. That I want it. That I think some additions as a safeguard or as a consistency, like, detract from what I find interesting about wine. So if I was going to reflect on how I got there, I realized quickly that the interest to me was not on something aligning with the palate of sort of the kingmakers. I'll call them the media, the critics, whatever. You know, in the mid-aughts, when I was learning about things and really exploring things, there was a lot of talk about the parkerization of wines, and I got a lot of opportunity to taste like things that were getting huge scores. I'll say that. I went to Paso Robles a lot, and I think what year? I don't remember exactly. What year, it might have been 2007, when they got the #1 wine in the world, and I don't even remember if it was Spectator or Advocate or whatever. And so, like, it was then that a handful of these places that were getting a ton of attention, I was getting to taste all of those things, and I was buying some of those things. And I was seeing what we would put on the shelves at the wine shop that I was working at in terms of driving people to them with scores. And I was starting to think, God, these all taste sort of the same. And they don't taste the same. You know, you can tell if it was a Cab or a Pinot, but there is, like, I am tasting wood influence. I am tasting a certain level of extraction. I am tasting a certain, like, the way excessive ripeness presents itself starts to taste the same to me. This is literally not interesting to me. It is interesting as an intellectual exercise of, can we refine winemaking processes to hit that palate, and we could. We've proven we can do that. In fact, we've proven that with certain things we can do that at a $15 price point, in terms of sweetness levels and color and influencing how the tannins strike people to make it feel more serious. And I was like, that's literally not interesting to me. That is like churning out a frozen dinner that someone's going to have the same every time. And so the nuance of like this here now seems to get lost. So one of the natural swings of that is to say, well, then the only thing that matters is that we take the grapes, we squeeze them, and we see what happens. And I know, I've never been like, this is a natural wine company, and here's exactly what a natural wine company means, and I only drink that, and I don't get a headache, and it's the only thing that matters. And yet, there's some aspect of that I do sort of feel inside. I just think that the conversation around that, or it can become as exclusive and as obnoxious as the point chasing. It only matters that you got to 26 bricks in what French barrel you can buy. I find they can be equally obnoxious. So not that I probably do say obnoxious things also, or have an obnoxious viewpoint of being annoyed with people in certain camps, and they might find me equally acting like I'm better than them. But so what I cared about then, how I got to that, is literally because that's what I find interesting about wine specifically. That's what I sort of ultimately feel is the most respectful to the grapes and what we're growing and what we're doing, which is that I can rely on what we have to make the best wine possible, but the best wine possible is the one that is most representative of what happened that year in that place, without me trying to craft towards a premeditated ideal, I guess. And so my premeditated ideals are that there are not obvious flaws, that when someone buys it, they can expect not to have something way off. But that's kind of, I don't want it to be off. I want to protect it from going off. And for the most part, I've done that. I have a few smoke taint stories from 2017, but
So I'm curious about, we talked about the pandemic, and obviously that's affected your sales strategy greatly. Sort of how else has your kind of, I guess, wine life been affected by the pandemic, and what do you see looking ahead for sort of pandemic recovery?
Yeah. So the week where everything kind of shut down, I was in jury duty, and I think it was the Thursday morning where I literally started to get like, hey guys, we're postponing this event because we're not exactly sure. We're postponing to June. We're postponing to August. Obviously, those have been more permanently postponed. So I think I had 5 events canceled, and like I said, I try to do one a month, maybe twice a month. So that was a big portion of the year. So that just stopped that's where I get exposure to new customers and new faces, and it's also where I, sell $1,000 worth of wine or $2,000 worth of wine and redo the coffer so that I can order the labels. I mean, I'm just, that's where I'm at, is, okay, what can we do next? Because we were able to move this inventory. So that took down that piece, but there's been a lot that has come up too. I initially offered delivery within Portland and got quite a few orders that I would have never got without that opportunity. That has quieted down as things have opened back up, but that was interesting, sort of recommitment from some of my best and loyal customers, like they're going to stock up, and that was a nice sort of surge there for a minute. A couple of online retail opportunities have opened up. One of them that I think is really interesting is At Your Door. So there's a cocktail lounge in the Pearl and restaurant that had to shut down, and they were like, what could we do? Maybe we can deliver meals to service workers because we have a kitchen here. So they were taking donations and they were doing delivery of meals. And then, so they were employing their wait staff to deliver meals to out-of-work wait staff and using their kitchen. And they heard that OLCC opened up for spirits delivery, and someone thought, no distilleries are going to be in a position to take advantage of that or have the infrastructure. What if we literally email distilleries tonight and say, we'll do that for you because we already have a delivery network set up? So super cool, innovative thing. And now they're doing some small wineries like myself and some breweries and some pantry stuff, and have started, and they're employing their bartending staff who really, they're back open, but and so doing local delivery, and that's a new sales channel for me that's done fine. Like, it's so passive for me. I just make sure that they have it and they have the material, and it really great group of people, and feels like something that people did good to respond to that. So those types of things have opened up a little bit. And then on the distribution side, anything that would have been the price point to really only be on-premise restaurant sales has just stopped. And anything that I sort of have in screw top in the $20 and under place, he's really able to get into groceries and kind of up. So, that's also been good, and people are buying wine in those areas. But what that means for my future planning is that I am scaling back a little bit on production because I have more inventory than I intended, a little bit, which does mean that I passed on some fruit that I've taken every year before, and I don't know what that'll mean about 2021. Except that what I hear is that farmers are calling place and saying, do you want Pinot? Do you want Pinot? Do you want Pinot? It looks like I'm gonna have excess Pinot. But I also hear which kind of happens every year, but I also hear the set is lower, at least in the, I've bought Eola Amity, and that is lower. I don't talk to that many farmers. So we'll see where that ends up, and whether I'll get back in on those contracts later. I'm comfortable with that. It feels like the right thing for me to do to get through some of what I have. And it's allowing me to do really small lots of slightly more obscure things this year. So I did a very tiny bit of Gamay 2 years ago. Loved it. It was easy to sell just because it was different. So I've been looking for and found a little bit more quantity this year, and I'm going to go with that. And that's the only red wine I'm going to make. But I also found some Sauvignon Blanc in the valley, which I really like to work with stuff that will get ripe, tastes good, but isn't something people see. And at events that people really respond to that, they come around and they're like, oh God, you have something besides Pinot. Pinot is what I have made the most of, so I'm not, but people get excited when you have something that's not Pinot. My Southern Oregon fruit I also am not working with this year, just because overall I'm cutting down, and I have some great 2 vintages of really good Syrah that is hard to move, so I'm just not going to make any more. People always get really excited to taste Syrah and then maybe buy one, and that's just, which I get that. So what does it look like post? I still don't know. I don't know when we're going to be in a position to have a Newport Seafood and Wine Festival with all those people in there, and that's like the type of thing where places that as small as me, I haven't done that event before, but I'm on the list to get in there, and that can make our year at my size. I mean, I hear it's not the funnest thing to work, but I don't know when those things happen, and I don't know what those things look like, and then I also don't know, like what I hear from my distributor about how people are buying wine. I don't know what that means for the upper end wines and the more unknown labels and things like that. And I feel like I'm in I'm conservatively enough invested that I can continue and I feel okay, but I don't know. There's consolidation in the distributors. There's buying habits that are different. There's the minimization of events. And I don't know. I hear like some of the prognosticators saying like, invest in your online sales outlets because those aren't going away. I don't know because it's such a personal thing. And then I also really care about this, like the Black Lives Matter movement, and and I feel like our industry is not, both from who works in it, who owns in it, and then who we market to, and so there's the inaccessible nature of it. It seems like possibly that level and up is getting cut off anyway, and so like, could we reinvent in some arenas where it actually sort of changes some aspect of the industry in a way in which there are channels for us to sell and interact and have consumers that are things we haven't even thought about before because we were blind to that? Because I don't think it was always like on purpose. I think there's some that is on purpose. But I think there's opportunity there. I don't know what it is. I mean, if I had the, to even have it be a business plan seems a little bit, I can't think of the word.
Crass?
Yeah. Yeah, and so I don't want it to be that. But I don't know if I'm allowed to use crass language.
Sure.
A lot of shit has blown up, and it getting put back together, I hope it doesn't look like it used to look, but I don't know exactly what it's going to look like.
Sure.
And I think the sequence of them, I think the global pandemic that threatened all of us physically coming first, maybe that's okay. But there's pain associated with it too, and I recognize that as a 400 case winery, that's my side gig. Again, possibly crass, but like my potential pain in terms of losing my business or things aren't working is less than some of my peers, and so I recognize that too. I don't know.
It's a really good answer. Thank you for that. Went a lot of different directions there. I really appreciate that, because it is kind of how I think how a lot of people are thinking and feeling right now. It's just a lot of uncertainty.
There's no crystal balls right now.
No crystal balls right now. No. I know one of the things that you did during the shutdown was virtual wine tasting back in the spring. Tell me a little about that, and how is that something you can kind of see as a future for your kind of business?
So I did the Gamay Festival. That was one of the events that got canceled, but they were gracious enough to include me in one of the tastings. I don't know how I feel about it. So we sold packs through at Southeast Wine Collective. So Division was a part of it, but it was at their wine shop and wine bar that sold it. I feel like maybe we sold a case of wine, which I'm always thrilled to sell a case of wine. And the interaction was fun. For me personally, the interaction with the other winemakers was the most fulfilling part. There were a couple of really active consumers or people who attended that were really fun to interact with. I recognize some of them as being industry people, so that's the only reason I'm even hesitating, because would I do something like that again? I absolutely would. Is it an ongoing, financially viable way of interacting? Maybe I struggle with that because in my role as consumer, which I still do, I'd have no interest in going to one whatsoever. It's just like, I want people around. I mean, part of the ethos of my brand is like, I hope that it facilitated you enjoying the people. I hope the people didn't facilitate you enjoying the wine, because the wine's gone and you're going to put the glass in the recycling. So I hope that your relationship is was what was fun, and that it was a part of that. I do want it to be a part of that. So virtual tastings seem lonely to me, or something. There's something about it that I had a good time, so I don't want to take away from that other people might really enjoy that format. It's less than ideal to me. The logistics also of getting the wine to the person, that's the other piece about tasting, is that you can, I can open a bottle and taste 15 to 20 people on it, and you can taste 5 or 6 different things if all of you can come to the bottle. Otherwise, you open the bottle, it's a much bigger investment for you to participate in the tasting on the consumer side, because you have to get the whole bottle, or we have to figure out some way to do Capri Suns of different packaging, which just feels like a lot of, I don't know. It plays into part of the accessing wine that is just not that interesting to me. The whole like wine country lifestyle stuff, and I'm doing this tasting, so they're sending me 3 ounces of Gruner Veltliner, or I don't know. It's just not it. This is not that interesting to me.
What do you see? What do you see as you look ahead for the Oregon wine industry then, coming out of this and looking ahead 5 or 10 years? What is the industry going to look like?
Oh man, I mean, there was a lot of I still feel like, and maybe there's a little bit of a reset in all of this, that allows us to continue to be innovative and experimental and a little more democratic in our what I would love to see and what I'd love to be a part of, and I don't know how to do it, it's certainly not something I can do alone, is I think that if you're in Portland, if you're in Oregon wine country, or if you're in like Brooklyn, or certain parts of places that there are distributors that are kind of aware and kind of adjacent, at least to the natural wine movement, you might have some exposure to the exciting stuff that's happening in Oregon. I'd love to see that be a little bit broader and people aware. So, it's a little bit cliche, but like we talk about, like people talk a lot about like what do millennials connect to, because they're our next market and all of this stuff. And when we talk about it in terms of like identifying our market and crafting it to try and hit that market, it's not that fun. But realistically, is it fun to me if people catch on that $15 pet nat with your friends when you're cooking eggs at, on a Saturday morning is fun? I do. That is fun to me. So if that means that we are finding the right products to get millennials excited about something, fine. But it's that. It's like there actually is maybe the Oregon New Guard experimental group hipster wine scene was getting a bit played out, but maybe this resets it a little bit. And maybe this tones it down from almost, it was getting to almost like an exclusive, are you natty enough? Maybe I'd love every market in the US who thinks about Oregon wine to know that you can both collect really world-class age-worthy Pinots, or you can get, something that someone in Carlton did that's cool for $18. And I don't feel like outside of maybe LA, New York, and Portland, people know that. So I'd love to see it go there. I don't know that we're going there. Then the other things that excite me is that I think Southern Oregon regions get some attention naturally because people outside are not aware of, when they say Oregon wine, we sort of have this established reputation, and they get the benefit of that. But I think what they're doing is super cool as climate change kind of moves things up, and some of what happens in California gets too much for me. So I think that's some exciting stuff that I hope. It seems to me that we have things happening in Portland that are celebrating those wines and bringing those wines in and putting them on equal footing with what's happening up here. And the Gorge has some really cool stuff. Anyway, so that is of interest to me. More specificity that's happening with some of the AVAs is of interest to me, but that's just kind of nerdy stuff. I don't know if that really matters to the market outside of, but I like that kind of specificity and like getting some more focus on that. Overall, I think the domestic wine industry has some real challenges that Oregon is just a part of. I think that it's impossible to differentiate yourself. I think that the consolidation of distribution makes it so that some of my hopes that I talked about earlier in other markets, understanding what happens in Oregon, I don't know how they're going to, because those wines were not available to me even in LA very readily. So I don't know what we do with that. And then I don't know in terms of like what we're growing and those sorts of things. I'm hopeful maybe there's a little reset here too in terms of us not pricing ourselves out of being able to continue to be experimental and not decide that we've settled on what we can and can't do here, because I think the stuff I like is stuff that people, and I'm not the only one who likes it by any means, but is when people try something and do something different. So I hope we can continue to do that. And we'll need the established big name collectible Pinots to continue to be taken seriously too, I'm sure.
What about his look ahead for yourself? You obviously talked about that already in terms of future, kind of uncertain, but if you do continue in wine and you grow, do you have a size in mind? Do you have a kind of an end point in mind?
End point, I don't. I would love to get a couple SKUs that have their markets outside of Oregon that are just sort of the engine. And then I don't always have a plan. I have a plan to make it to next harvest. I have a plan to cover the expenses, so that I can keep doing it and sort of see where it goes. I would like to figure out a way, and I have not figured out a way, to have somewhere where people can come always to get and taste the wines without opening my own tasting room. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I think there's a lot of different potential options that looks like. But I know when people get introduced to the wines, they like them and buy them. And so I need to get to that point. And I absolutely don't want to lease my own building and run a crew right now. So I don't know exactly what that looks like. Again, there's something in the back of my mind that says there's going to be so much reinvention of how space is used and how places open back up, and lease options and co-op options that I've always been trying to keep aware and keep my feelers out, and it's felt like options have presented themselves in convenient times. So I would like to get to, I feel like somewhere in the 2,000 to 3,000 case mark is where there can start to be a little bit of a profit, and I can start to make some investments in terms of equipment and space of my own, and I would love for the trajectory of my winemaking learning and the trajectory of my production to meet at a perfect point where I'm ready to have my own space and do my own thing. I don't know if that's 3 years from now or 5 years from now, and I'm happy with what's happening this fall, and that's about all that I'm securing.
Perhaps as far as any of us want to look right now.
School, if we can get through the first week of school. Oh, yeah.
If someone were to come to you and say they were interested in joining the Oregon wine industry in some fashion, what would your words of wisdom to them be?
Words of wisdom. I think I have had people, generally younger people, come to my table and say, I'm doing my first internship, or I'm studying my, at Chemeketa, or whatever the case. I think there's three things. The first thing is that I find the vast majority of people I've interacted with to be open and warm and genuine, and in this for reasons that you might assume, in terms of there's something engaging, there's something authentic, and while I sometimes think there's a sheen of the way we've marketed and acted as inauthentic, I find that people, particularly in the organ industry, to be pretty down-to-earth, real, kind people who want to share and want everyone to do well. And so for those reasons, I would never tell someone to avoid it. There's also something about the industry that can be a little bit flaky, a little bit non-committal.
No.
The sort of sexy ideal of growing grapes and working in a tasting room and being adjacent to some ideal of wine doesn't always align with great business practices. So keep your eyes and ears open and make good decisions. And and it's a small enough industry that reputation does. I don't know. I feel like the industry doesn't really know me, and I don't know that many people in the industry. That's probably not as true as I think. I probably do know quite a few people, but reputations are quickly established, both good and bad. So be just be true to your word. Be kind and respectful and open, and perpetuate that culture that really does already exist here. That will serve you well, because the bad eggs are like known. I'm not, because it's a small industry. That happens in my other side of life too, so that's not unique to wine, but that's a bit of advice. And then always keep in mind that the product selling is like, it has to happen if this is going to continue. So you can't just be, ultimately you have to also work within the confines of the commercial side of it, which is probably a lot less sexy than the production or the lifestyle or the marketing or the fun part of it, because it is fun. I wouldn't do it if it wasn't fun. But if there's not a sales plan, then it's not gonna go anywhere. So just, even in the production side, like, decisions have to do with money and time and what's going to result, and what the margin's going to be on the end result, and how much is going into distribution, and how much you're going to be able to DTC, and like all of that, it does matter, because ultimately it is only sustainable as a business. But it is fun. That's what you think about. If someone's just getting started because they think it's going to be fun, they're not wrong. It's a product to enhance moment and pleasure, and like, it's fun. Delicious.
Right. That's all the questions that I have for you.
Okay.
Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover that we should have covered? All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for your
Thank you,
time
guys.
today, for your hospitality in this wonderful day in the valley here, or the sort of valley here. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thank you.
Thank you.